In a fog-covered piece of land, far away from everything that's holy, lies a small village named Solitude. Its ruler, Sir Wolf, lives for one single purpose: to make every peasant's life a living nightmare, to create hell on earth. Alone and secluded in his chambers, he invented devices so gruesome and cruel that just by looking at them, every farmer near Solitude is going to work night and day to avoid having to endure these torments himself. And he invented quite a few of them, so let's maybe get started with the video. Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another Stronghold Crusader build. I wanted to make a special Halloween episode, and what better way to do that than to build the torture instruments from Stronghold Crusader. So let's begin with the first, very simple contraption, one of the all-time classics, the Gallows. I began with cutting some sticks to size on my circular saw, to then cut out the poles and the 4 angled pieces at the bottom. These 2 distances didn't seem the same to me, so I cut these 4 pieces down here to the really fun angles of 50.9 and 39.1 degrees. To connect the vertical to the horizontal pole, I drilled a hole inside of here and filed out the rest, because I've split a small piece like this way too many times using a chisel. Then I glued it in there and used another thinner stick with 45-degree angles as a support, and because it is like that in the game. And if you believe it or not, I don't know how to tie a hangman's knot, so I had to look that up, and even though this is just a bolt, it still seems kinda dark to do this. Okay, as I already said, a really simple building up front, and normally I'm burning the wood to make it look old, but this time I wanted to try out one of my older steel wool vinegar stains just to see how the color of the wood changes. While the gallows were drying, I started to make the gibbet. The principle is pretty much the same as for the gallows, but there are some tiny differences. This time the bottom pieces are at 45 degrees, and I used this template and my saw guide here to help me get some clean cuts. Another small difference is that on the gibbet the horizontal pole seems to be shoved onto and not through the vertical pole. And another one, here are 2 cross braces instead of 1, and that makes sense because it has to not only support the weight of the human but also the cage. At that point the gallows have also dried, and this color is not at all what I was going for. This is looking way too red and rusty. Wow, who would have thought? So I burned and scrubbed everything again, and now it's looking better. Back to the gibbet. There is this platform around the bottom here, and before making more wooden slices and burning them to make them look old, I remembered that I have a lot of actual old wood in my workshop. This here, for example, was an old apple crate that broke apart some time ago, and all I had to do was to cut it into strips on my bandsaw. Now that the wooden part is done, we can begin with the cage. I cut out a few of these strips from this thin sheet metal, and I tried my best to draw an oval shape on there to cut it out as well. My plan here was to attach the metal strips on one side, then bend it over to attach it on the other side again, and to make sure that the strips are actually holding, I drilled some holes in the oval, then superglued the strips on there, drilled through the strips, glued some tiny nails inside and cut them off to hammer them round like a rivet. Once the basic shape was done, I began to glue the narrower horizontal strips on there one by one, and this detail isn't visible on the gibbet in-game, but it would just be logical to have a door somewhere on the cage. So I decided to not glue the strips on there, to cut them off right here and use them as hinges. I didn't film a whole lot of the process because I struggled quite a bit with making this door, but after some super gluing and tiny nail riveting, we have a functioning little door. If we're looking at the in-game building again, we can see that the cage is being held up by a chain, and we obviously still have to make this little chain. Another really fun device are the stocks, which is, according to Wikipedia, not the right term for this because stocks are devices that only restrain the feet. The right term would be a pillory, but we're not here to discuss the name of this device. We want to punish some peasants, and for the grey parts on the side that are probably supposed to be made out of stone, I'm using this thick piece of gypsum that I cut out of the keep. The overall shape was pretty easy to carve out. The slot in the middle was a little trickier because it doesn't go all the way through. I used the depth limit on the drill press to drill out 2 holes. And later whittle out the rest with the X-Acto blade and some tiny files. For the wooden part I used 2 boards and glued them together just to drill the hole in the middle, then took them apart again and connected the 2 pieces with a thin leather strip. Maybe I could have used a metal hinge, but I thought it would be too difficult to make one small enough to fit into the slot on the side. With some meat skewer dowels and the wooden part as spacer, I glued the outer parts onto a base plate, and I also made these 2 small metal parts because I wanted to add one more tiny detail. But before adding that one, I wanted to adjust the color of the gypsum using some magic chisel sharpening powder and some water. For the last detail I used a 5mm thick piece of steel and cut a tiny rectangle out of it, then drilled 2 holes in the top, and with the help of a small piece of wire we are now able to lock the pillory. I gotta say, throwing rotten tomatoes at peasants that are locked in the gibbet and the pillory is pretty fun, but you know what's even funnier? Burning a witch on the stake! Yeah! Come with me children, let's look how... who's on the list today? Eleanor, right. Let's look how Eleanor is getting burned, because last night at the inn she gave me a weird look. I'm obviously joking, but on the in-game building it also looks like the henchman is just having fun by saying, "Oh, almost slipped. There's not much to be said here. I used a Forstner bit to drill a hole in a base plate, and instead of a straight pole I used a branch because I thought this one gives the stake a little more character. I don't know if that makes sense, but I glued it in there and also started to glue some sticks around here to create a base for the fire. This fuzzy stuff in the middle could be branches, but I used hay, and I really didn't know how to glue all the stalks in place, so I just covered everything in wood glue and added some sticks on the hay and used even more wood glue, and on the next day the wood glue was nice and clear and everything was holding together quite alright. I've also added the rope that is bound around here for whatever reason, and the chain with which the witch is chained to the pole. The witch burning was definitely a highlight in medieval entertainment, but let's go on to the next fun pastime activity, watching a public beheading at the chopping block. At first glance it seems like a pretty easy build, but like many other times the devil lies in the detail. Let's get started with the wooden platform that I simply made out of wooden planks. I cut them to size, glued one side together, cut the excess off, glued the second side together and realized that I made the same side again. After remaking the left side, I simply connected them with more wooden slabs. For the chopping block itself, I used the keep gypsum again and drew this shape on there, carved it out, then used a file to carve out the round portion, and that's already it. So far so good, but now it's getting interesting. Right next to the chopping block is the executioner's axe. For the axe head, I drew the shape onto a 3mm thick piece of steel, then cut away as much as possible with the angle grinder, grinded it down with a rough disc, and lastly tapered it in the front and made the bevel with a finer disc. I drilled the hole in the back, and now it's time for the handle. The first one I made seemed a little too short and looked more like a woodcutter's axe, so I thought I could just glue another stick onto the end and wrap a leather strip around it to make it look like a cool leather wrapped handle, but even this thin leather was way too thick for this tiny axe. This longer handle is looking better, and to secure it properly I added another tiny detail, this metal wedge that I hammered into the top. The most complicated chopping block detail is yet to come, the bucket. I made a few different versions of buckets already. Here the first one from the dairy farm. This one is the one from the bakery. This is a barrel, but the principle is pretty much the same. If you were to cut this in half, you'd have 2 buckets. And this one is the doo-doo budget bucket, also from the dairy farm. That is just a piece of wood with a hole in it. So bucket quality wise, I would say these are the 3 stages, and this time I wanted to make an even better looking bucket. The biggest problem I'm having when making a miniature bucket is to get the geometry of the staves right. That's what the boards that form the walls of the bucket are called. And I gotta be honest, I wanted to explain this a little more in detail and wanted to show you all my failed attempts, but that's just too much for this video. So here's the technique I ended up using. I tried to make the wooden strips for the staves as thin as possible, then cut them to length, and to get the angle somewhat right, I 3D printed a template to lay the staves into and cut the part that is sticking out away with a chisel. Then I cut out 2 round slabs out of a piece of hardwood and glued them together with a stick. The smaller one is going to be the bottom panel and the larger one is just a guide. Then I glued the strips around the round pieces, only putting glue around the bottom panel, and for the hoop I used my standard thin sheet metal and small nail riveting technique, and it doesn't look all too great, but hey! Then I removed the guide and the stick in the middle, cut the top of the staves off because to me it seems like this is a rather short but wide bucket, and after staining we finally have a tiny wooden bucket. Now does this one look better than the ones before? No, but either way, now we have all the details for the chopping block, and after gluing them in place I used some fake blood to make it look like the in-game building. And I gotta say, I'm surprised, this is looking quite realistic. The chopping block grants a quick and painless death, if the executioner does it correctly, but sometimes we don't want to kill the peasants and end their suffering right away. So for that we have a really fun invention, the whipping dungeon. The first challenge here is that most of the building is below the ground level, and I could have made a giant box filled with sand to place the dungeon inside, but that seemed a bit excessive to me, so we simply gotta imagine that the dungeon, how I'm going to build it, is below the ground. The first step was to make the walls, and that means it's time for my archenemy Mr. Gypsum. I gotta be honest, this time I really didn't want to build a mold and pour the gypsum in and clean everything and make a huge mess, so I thought I might be able to do a little editing magic and what the... Okay, never mind then. I wanted to make one mold for the entire building. That means making a frame for the outside that I can screw together and making 2 more frames for the inside. One for the stair hole and one for the hole where the peasants are. By gluing the inside molds together like this with very little hot glue, I wanted to make sure that they're easy to take apart again, even though they're surrounded with gypsum. One detail that isn't there, or that we at least can't see on the in-game building, but that makes sense to me, is that the steps and this room are connected by an underground passage with a fortified door. So I connected the two inside molds with this little piece to keep the space free, and I also added another box made out of scrap pieces in this space here just to save some gypsum. Making a mold in the exact shape of the stairs would take quite a bit of time, so I simply made one like this instead to later cut out the steps. I calculated how much gypsum I will need, and this time the amount was right, but it was a little too thick, and to get it into these narrow spaces was quite a challenge. On the next day, I first took the frame for the stairs apart, and that worked perfectly. Then I took the frame on the outside apart, and that worked perfectly. Then I got to the inside frames, and they didn't come out perfectly, but I got them out without breaking anything, and that's a win in my book. To cut the stairs out, I made a highly advanced jig, and just like the walls, I made the stair mold a little taller to cut the excess off and get a perfect fit, but I cut off a little too much and now we have these gaps here. I honestly thought about remaking the stairs, but then I remembered that I wanted to use this slow drying plaster mixture to connect them to the building in the first place, so I just had to use a little more. I added a nice layer on the sides first and made sure to cover every step, then let it dry for a little bit but not completely to scrape away all the excess from the side walls and the edges, and I think this turned out looking pretty clean. Now that the basic structure is done, we are ready for the details, starting with the paving on the ground level. I wanted to print out the template from the in-game building like I did for the storage of the keep, but it ended up looking really bad, and on the back here we can't even see the floor.
Actually, you can see the back of the hatch and the floor when placing the building.
Nosferatu, you better watch your mouth or I'll open a window. This little. So I decided to simply draw some random shapes on there. I then cut out all the spaces in between to end up with this pattern that is already looking okay, but it gets really brought to life by the magic chisel sharpening powder. I didn't cover the outside of the walls here because this is technically underground, so I simply glued some burnt and scrubbed plywood around it, and I also added the door already that can be opened and closed. This tiny door was pretty simple to make. I cut out this part on 2 wooden strips, then started to horizontally glue a wooden strip, a hinge, 2 more wooden strips and another hinge on there, and for the bars I cut some wires to size, hammered them into the wood to create a groove where I can then glue them into. I later added the second part of the hinges and glued the frame around the wires, added these decorative metal strips and a handle on the front, and covered the door with the steel wool vinegar stain. Next up are the bars that cover the hole where the peasants are. I didn't glue this last strip on there yet because I still wanted to connect the hatch to it before gluing it on there. And we obviously still have to make this hatch as well. Looking at the in-game building, to me it looks like this hatch isn't even made out of wood, and it looks like it's one solid piece, but I still made it out of wooden planks. I started by connecting 2 hinges to this metal strip, then glued the other sides of the hinges onto 2 wooden boards and secured them with tiny nails. Then I glued the rest of the boards together, and now it's already looking pretty good, but after gluing everything in place, decorating the border with these metal strips and adding this diagonal board also as decoration onto the front, we have a pretty good looking hatch. I still wanted to adjust the color of the underside of the hatch to this brown greenish tone, so I simply used the wall paint to get it a little closer and a few drops of fake blood to finish the job. Now the dungeon is almost finished, but one detail that's still missing is the pole behind the hatch. Okay, the last detail is the chain, and this one seems to be bigger than the chain of the Gibbet, but is still round. And I don't know why, but I thought about the shape of a normal chain, so I used this pencil to wrap the wire around and ended up with this chain. By the way, I'm also not really sure why this chain is there in the first place. I guess it's holding the hatch up, but either way I glued half of a chain link into the pole, wrapped the chain around the hatch and glued a hook into the bottom of the pole to secure it there. I gotta admit, this dungeon took me longer than I've expected, because looking at it like this, it doesn't seem like there are a whole lot of details. But now we can finally lock some peasants up. Yeah, oh, I'm so excited. Dear citizens old and young, come by to admire the new attraction of Solitude's Horror Fun Park. Here you can whip and web, flog and clobber and knock the 7 bells out of every peasant inside the dungeon. With our new edition of child-sized whips, we guarantee fun for the whole family, so take one each and whip it, whip it, whip it! Next on the list is another crowd favorite, the ducking stool. Now, what I'm about to tell you is real history and none of my invented shenanigans. This device was mostly used for women that defied social norms. For example, if a woman was complaining a lot in public or speaking disrespectfully to her husband, she was put onto the ducking stool. The purpose of this was not only to punish herself by publicly humiliating her, but also to use her as an example to control other women who were trying to speak their minds and resist male authority. And I understand that this is really messed up, but in my tainted dark comedy mind, it is almost funny to do this for such a trivial reason. I'm just playing out this bit in my head of a woman speaking to her husband, and she says to him, "Do you want another bowl of soup, my dear?" And he answers with, "What? Are you thinking I can eat another bowl? Are you calling me a fat pig, you harlot? Onto the ducking stool with her!" And that he does this with every tiny little reason. But anyways, building wise it's pretty much the same structure as the Gallows and the Gibbet, except here we have 2 bigger poles on each side and only 2 instead of 4 angled support pieces. The horizontal pole on the top is not static because it's only connected to the other poles with this stick, where I drilled the hole on the ends to glue some tiny wooden pegs inside. For the chair I used a flat piece of hardwood where I cut out these parts for the back side, then simply glued the square sitting board on there and glued the 2 legs onto the square sitting board. This isn't the prettiest or most stable chair, but it's good enough to dunk someone into the water. I later covered it with the steel wool vinegar stain and tied it to the front of the pole. Put another bit of string around the back, and I also drilled 2 holes into the bottom of the poles and glued 2 sticks inside that I can later stick into the ground. Speaking of the ground, we still need something that functions as the ground, and more importantly, something that resembles water. I was honestly thinking about using real water and making some kind of container for it, but I ended up using another method that I lifted from the miniature community. I first tried to print out a template of this lake, or this tiny puddle, and I scaled it wrong, but I glued it on there anyways to get a rough feel for the shape. Then I cut the inside out by drilling some holes around the border and some bigger holes in the center, filing, sanding and burning it to get this piece. At that point I wasn't trying to make an actual hole filled with water anymore. I wanted to pour a layer of epoxy resin in here that should only resemble the water. So I cut off a piece from a thin transparent tarp and glued it onto the bottom with super glue. Now, even though the water layer is only going to be 1 centimeter thick, I still wanted to make a box deep enough to dunk the chair into. Because I'm only using this epoxy resin for the second time, I wasn't sure how much you'll be able to see through it, so I preemptively spray painted the inside of the box black, and once the paint was dry, I also threw some rocks and a bit of sawdust and dirt in there to make it seem like a nice natural bottom of a lake. The preparations are done, so let's get to the epoxy. That is normally clear, but here it's just looking a little blue because of the lighting. To get it to a watercolor, I used some blue food coloring powder, and like this it was looking a bit too bright and friendly, so I added a tiny bit of yellow powder to get it more to an aquamarine-like color. When pouring it in, I quickly realized that you can barely see the bottom. Maybe here on the right you can see one of the white stones shining through, but what ended up making this look a little better were the ripples that the tarp already had before. And while curing the epoxy resin with this UV lamp, I also tried to lift it up a bit to create some extra ripples. Once it was dry, I tried this mud patch. No, this mud patch? Machu Picchu? Such a bad joke. I tried this for the first time because while watching miniature water videos, it seemed that everybody and their grandma were using it, so I wanted to give it a try as well. I applied a reasonable amount, I guess, and maybe I did it wrong, but after letting it dry for a little bit, I honestly couldn't tell the difference. But either way, now it's time to drill the holes into the bottom layer to glue the poles inside, and that's it for the ducking stool. The purpose of the devices I've built so far was to torture someone in order to punish them and to scare them to make them work faster. And it also scares other people to make them work faster as well. That's at least what the effect in the game does. And that makes sense to me, but with the Cesspit, or how I like to call it, the shit pit, I'm not quite sure how that's supposed to make peasants work faster. Maybe it's supposed to make them walk faster because they're trying to get away from the stench as fast as possible. I don't know, but either way. Contrary to the ducking stool paddle that only looks like it has some depth to it, the Cesspit actually has to be a hole in the ground, and to achieve that I made another wooden box with a lid where I cut a hole into. The white stuff that I filled the box with is a slice of an Etong brick, because it's really easy to cut and really easy to sculpt. With an old screwdriver I started to carve out the hole, and once I was happy with the shape, I covered the entire thing with some wood glue and sprinkled this sawdust and dirt mixture over it to create a somewhat natural looking ground. On the next day I dumped the excess out and drilled the hole in here, because on the in-game building there is one detail that I can see at least, and that is this wooden pole with a string attached to it. I glued this pole inside here and patched up some of the spots where the Etong brick was still visible, and something I wanted to mention as well is that technically I could have used real dirt for this, but I wasn't sure how that would react to the next step, because right now it is just a pit without the cess. Okay, let's get to the toilet and fill it up. No, I obviously didn't do that. I started to drizzle some of my steel wool vinegar stain over it to make it darker, and it almost seemed like it was water repellent at first, but it started to soak in pretty quickly. Then I used some epoxy resin again, this time with a 50-50 mixture of blue and yellow powder to get this slimy green color, and after adding some red powder to the green mixture, we are getting this nice, tasty looking brown color. Some UV light action, and this is looking really messy and disgusting. Exactly how it's supposed to look. Okay, we've already built quite a few parts, but there are still 2 more builds to go. Let's go back to one of the more well-known torture instruments, the stretching rack. This one was definitely the most complicated to build because I wanted it to be functional. And how I build it might not be exactly the way it is functioning in the game, but this is how I'm imagining it to work. The 4 rollers on the corners are separate, one for each limb. Let's take one of them as an example. By turning it, the rope gets tangled up around this axis, making the rope shorter and shorter. The end of the rope goes across the length of the stretching rack, then comes back up on the other side where it is first guided through this chain and then connected to the shackle. So to my understanding, if we're imagining the head to be right here, this roll is pulling on the right leg. And now that that is clear, let's get into the build. I started with the 4 feet and 2 wooden planks to connect them by cutting out this gap from the feet to glue the planks inside here. Even though I wanted to build a piece like this, I still used the full wooden plank because I thought it would be easier to cut this part out once they're glued inside instead of cutting them out beforehand. Before gluing these 2 parts onto the base plate, I drilled a hole in each corner where the rollers with the handles are supposed to go through. Once they were in the right distance from each other, I glued the first row of wooden planks on here and later covered everything with the steel wool and vinegar stain. For the rollers I went over to the wood lathe and started to cut this old broom handle down to a 16mm diameter because that's the diameter of the head part. Once that was done, I made lines in the right distance and shaved the other 2 parts down to their correct diameter as well. Now that we have this piece, we can mark the holes for the handles by finding the center of this circle first, then dividing it with 8 45-degree lines, then transferring them around the corner to the sides and make a line in the middle of this head part. I punched the holes with this pointy thing and drilled 3mm holes on my drill press to then glue some meat skewers inside these holes. If you're looking at the in-game building again, we can see this metal disc on the front here, and I can't really think of any practical reason for this to be here, but I still wanted to add it even if it's only decorative. So I simply cut a piece of this steel rod and filed it flat to glue it inside this hole in the center of the roller. The last step was to cover it in my homemade stain, and with that I have one finished roller, and now I only have to make the others. I gotta be honest, this first one took quite some time and I really didn't want to make 3 more, so I tried to harness the power of Ancient to perform the dark ritual. Okay, the preparations are done. Now I should just be able to... Huh? What the... I gotta try this again. Huh? Jerry, what are you doing here? Okay, one more try. Oh, finally, thank God. Thanks Satan, this worked. One thing I still had to do was to drill a hole into the end here to attach the string to, and now we can put the roller through here. To secure it, I cut off a piece of an aluminum tube and drilled a hole through there to be able to put this over the roll, drill a hole and glue a nail inside. Looking at the in-game building again, we can see that the side of the stretching rack is covered in nails, or bolts, I don't know. And I decided to simply make this a decorative feature again by burning and scrubbing 4 wooden planks, then drilling lots of holes and gluing lots of nails in there, cut them off and file them nice and flat. Before gluing them around the stretching rack though, I wanted to make sure that the rollers are working properly, and it was a good idea to check that beforehand because I was already expecting that the string would fall off on the end here when turning the roll, and it did. To work better with the stretching rack I had to rip it off the base plate again, and after some time and after modifying some parts I was able to fix this rope problem. First I added these round parts on the end of each roll, then I glued this wooden board with slots on the bottom on there to further guide the strings, and instead of letting them go beneath this board at the end, I let the strings go through a hole in the board. It's kinda hard to explain this, and this is looking a little confusing right now, but after adding this frame around here and covering up the machinery, it's looking a little friendlier. Then I glued and nailed the chains on there and covered the ends with this border, guided the ropes through the chains on all 4 sides, and before you know it, we have a nice stretching rack. For these shackles I used a strip of thin sheet metal that I bent around the nail first, then glued them together and drilled a hole through both ends to put this wire through there and tie the rope to the wire. Now the big question, does it work? I would say yes, it actually kinda does. Alright, the stretching rack was the second to last torture instrument, which leads us to the final build, that I almost forgot because it's so tiny and uninteresting, and that is the head on a spike. In-game you can only place these onto the castle walls with merlons, but I thought it would be a little excessive to make a huge piece of wall just to stick this tiny detail on there. And if I had looked at the in-game detail correctly, I would have added a spike to the head on a spike. But on my reference picture I placed the skull in front of a birch tree that was in the background, so I didn't see the point. You really can make this stuff up. So I thought it was just a skull on a pole. Because I already downgraded the spike to a pole, let's at least make the skull look really good. And I gotta say, I'm not an artist, I don't know a lot about painting, and I don't know anything about sculpting either. And it shows. I tried to carve it out of a piece of gypsum, and from the side it was looking okayish, but the front is not looking so good. This was my first attempt and my only attempt, so this is as good as it's gonna get. To attach the skull to the stick, or in my case a bent piece of wire, I drilled the hole in the back and glued the wire inside, and I wanted to do this and call it a day, but this just reminded me of an ugly looking snake. To make this look a little better, I attached a wire to this piece of wood, and I thought I might as well add a little bit of fake blood, which then gave me another idea to cut a groove into the skull, make a pike blade and glue it inside of there. Then I couldn't decide whether or not I should add a handle to the pike, and I ended up doing so, and that's my interpretation of the head on a spike from Stronghold Crusader. It is looking nothing like the in-game detail, but I still kinda like how it turned out. And that's it! Now we can finally open our Solitude Horror Fun Park, where you can torture peasants to your heart's content. I'm going in there myself now. I think I'll try the ducking stool on my wife. I wish you a happy spooky season, and as always, thanks for watching.